the memorial lecture, which pays tribute to Anuradha Gandhi almost 9 years after her untimely death on April 12th, 2008. I am grateful for this opportunity to visit Mumbai, and I'd like to thank the members of the Memorial Committee, P.K. Das, and all of the members of the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial Lecture Committee. And I also thank my friend Chandra Talpati Mohanty for allowing me to imagine this visit many, many years before it finally materialized. And finally, I thank Dr. Elena Sen, whom I met 5 years ago in Delhi when her husband, Binayak Sen, was still in prison. Since I've been here during this trip, I have met a number of political prisoners. And I am reminded of the era which was depicted on film, and I have to say that I find it really difficult to watch myself on the screen, especially so many, many years ago. But since I have arrived, a number of people have approached me to tell me about their involvement here in Mumbai in the campaign for my freedom. Is it possible to keep the lights up? Yes, yes. I would actually like to see the people whom I'm addressing. Thank you very much. And I'm reminded of that era, which was such a difficult era, with Richard Nixon as the President of the United States. And I mention it very specifically because of the new political circumstances that have evolved in the US. And perhaps I'll allude to those circumstances before my talk is over. But let me say how grateful I am for the opportunity to examine and reflect on the life and work of Anuradha Gandhi, whose capacity to link scholarship, pedagogy, and radical on-the-ground activism was exemplary. Over the last few days of my visit to Mumbai, I have encountered a number of people who have spoken about the profound influence Anuradha Gandhi had on their lives, either as a person with whom they were directly connected or as a great influence with respect to her ideas and all of her various activisms. And of course, also with respect to the way she chose to live her life. And I'd like to refer also, as did P.K. Das, to the illuminating foreword by Arundhati Roy to the collection of writings entitled Scripting the Change. I learned from that foreword that despite a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, Anuradha Gandhi worked with the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army for a number of years in the early 90s, living in the Dandakaranya forest in Bastar. There she worked in support of what Arundhati Roy called, and I'm quoting, perhaps the biggest feminist organization in the country, the Kantikari Adivasi Mahila Sangathan, and excuse me if my pronunciation isn't correct, I'm trying, that has more than 90,000 members. Anuradha Gandhi realized how important it was to develop deep relationships with communities that were and remain subjugated and oppressed in India. And what I find absolutely extraordinary about her interactions with Adivasi and Dalit communities is her apparent awareness of the deeply problematic approach that often prevents many well-meaning people from entering into egalitarian relationships with marginalized groups. In other words, she seems to have been intensely aware that if one brings an assumed superiority into the relationship, as is unfortunately so often the case with those who see themselves as missionaries or providers of charity, it is possible to replicate and consolidate social hierarchies even as one thinks one is dismantling them. This is a pervasive problem with respect to racism, and probably with respect to, oh, people can't hear? You can't hear. You can't? Okay. I was just informed that you couldn't hear, so let's see. Perhaps this will be a bit better. And I was saying that this is a pervasive problem, both with respect to racism and casteism. Moreover, my impression is that she learned as much or more from the Dalit and Adivasi communities with which she worked as she herself was able to teach. During this era, when we are experiencing the dislocations created by global capitalism and what we might call the enlivened vestiges of colonialism and the relentless ideological influences of neoliberalism that are nurtured by such forces as Islamophobia, racism, casteism, xenophobia, we are in need more than ever of Anuradha Gandhi's inspiration. Therefore, I decided to broadly organize my remarks around the topic Black Lives, Dalit Lives, Histories, and Solidarities. Because I would like to think about and try to link the collective predicament of Black people in the US and Dalit people in India. And to do this is not to assume that race and class are fundamentally the same. It is not to assume that the one can be reduced to or explained by the other. At the same time, it can be argued that there are many insights to be gleaned by thinking together about two different peoples and two different modes of subjugation. In order to subvert the assumption that those in the global South are forever placed in a position of having to learn from those in the global North, and that even the oppressed in the South have more to learn from the oppressed in the North, I'm interested in how we in the United States can learn from the long history of struggles of the Dalit people in India. And so I'd like to look at the moments of contact, a number of moments of contact, however brief they may have been, between these two histories. These moments of contact, it seems to me, remain promises that allow us to imagine stronger ties of solidarity in the future. In the aftermath of the constitutional abolition of slavery in the United States, here in the state of Maharashtra, Jyotirao Phule dedicated his 1873 book, Gulamgiri. Correct pronunciation? He dedicated this book to anti-slavery activists in the United States. And when Phule called upon the lower caste and the Dalits to unite to defeat the caste system, he was making a connection with people struggling against the enslavement of black people. And this was one of those moments of promise, a promise of solidarity, a promise we need to hold on to as we imagine and attempt to build solidarity in the present. Of course, many people have pointed out that when Dr. B.R. Ambedkar studied at Columbia University in New York, he was certainly aware of black movements. Columbia is located on the edge of, actually Columbia is in Harlem, although it is often represented as being located on the edge of Harlem, that is to say, not really in Harlem. But of course, at that time, Harlem had long been considered the capital of Black America. Moreover, Ambedkar's contemporary, W.E.B. Du Bois, through his scholarly and activist work, repeatedly points to the pivotal importance of India to the fate of people of African descent all over the world. And it's interesting that in the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois, which are in an archive which is housed at the University of Massachusetts, there is a note that is included, a note written by Dr. Ambedkar, who contacted Du Bois in the 1940s to ask about the National Negro Congress petition to the United Nations. And Ambedkar explained that he had been, quote, and I'm quoting, a student of the Negro problem. And he said, there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of the Negroes in America, that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary. In July of 1946, Du Bois wrote back, and I have to say that I'm nostalgic about those days when we actually wrote letters. But he wrote back responding that he was aware of the work that Dr. Ambedkar was doing, and that he, quote, had every sympathy with the untouchables of India. But many black people in the US may have only encountered Dalit struggles through Dr. Martin Luther King, who drew a direct connection between race and caste. And I'd like to read a rather long passage from a document written by Dr. King in 1959. It is entitled, "My Trip to the Land of Gandhi." And there is even here the problem of segregation. We call it race in America, he wrote. They call it caste in India. In both places, it means that some are considered inferior, treated as though they deserve less. We were surprised and delighted to see that India has made greater progress in the fight against caste untouchability than we have made here in our own country against race segregation. Both nations have federal laws against discrimination, but after this has been said, we must recognize that there are great differences between what India has done and what we have done on a problem that is very similar. The leaders of India have placed their moral power behind the law. From the prime minister down to the village councilman, everybody declares publicly that untouchability is wrong. This was in 1959. But in the United States, some of our highest officials declined to render a moral judgment on segregation. And some from the South publicly boast of their determination to maintain segregation. This would be unthinkable in India. Well, I read this rather long passage from King's papers because I think it allows us not only to understand his profound misreading of the situation at that time in India, but it also reveals the limits of the law and thus the limits of an exclusively civil rights strategy with respect to ending both casteism and racism. In other words, had King examined casteism within a less reductive framework, he might have assumed that he might not have assumed that the only path toward ending casteism consisted of changes in the law. Just as the Black freedom movement in the US at that time had begun to move along a trajectory defined precisely by the limits of the law. In other words, prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it might have been possible to develop a more complex approach to ending racism, particularly given the failure of constitutional changes in India to end casteism. Of course, King's ideas transformed as the movement matured, and indeed at the end of his life, the strategies had shifted from an exclusively civil rights strategies to labor movements and poor people's economic power. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, he was in Memphis, Tennessee, interestingly enough, in support of Black sanitation workers. He was there to participate in a strike that was being conducted by Black sanitation workers. And I say interestingly enough, precisely because sanitation work is the hereditary occupation of the Dalits. So that's a very interesting conjuncture. There's another moment of contact between Black Americans and Dalit people with the founding of the Dalit Panther Party in 1972, am I right? Yeah, 1972. Some 6 years after the creation of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. Now, some have argued